Tessa Warren came off a long hospital shift, and her head still rang with noise. The week had been heavy, and her body felt tight with fatigue. Her 11-year-old daughter, Sophie Warren, rode home with her earlier, then ran ahead to the porch. Tessa stayed in the car one extra minute, breathing slowly, hoping the house would feel calm. The rain began as a thin mist, then turned into a cold, steady sheet. When Tessa finally stepped out, she noticed Sophie was not inside. She saw her on the front steps, soaked through, shivering hard, clutching her backpack. Sophie looked up like she had been waiting forever, and her cheeks were streaked with rain. Tessa asked what happened, and Sophie tried to answer, but her voice came out small. Sophie said the key did not work, and the door would not open. Sophie said she knocked again and again, and nobody came. So she waited. Tessa felt her stomach twist. Then she tested the lock herself. The key slid in, turned, then stopped, like the mechanism had been replaced. Tessa knocked hard, rang the bell, then knocked again, louder. After a long pause, the door opened a few inches, and the chain stayed on. Diane Mercer, Tessa's mother, stood there dry and calm, as if nothing was wrong. Diane looked past Tessa and stared at Sophie like Sophie was an inconvenience. Tessa asked why Sophie was left outside in the rain, and Diane answered with no urgency. Diane said Sophie should have gone somewhere else, and the house was busy. Tessa asked how long Sophie had been out there, and Sophie whispered 5 hours. Heat rushed into Tessa's face, then a colder, steadier feeling settled in. She asked Diane why the locks were changed, and Diane opened the door wider, still blocking the entry. The hallway lights were warm, and the air smelled like coffee and something sweet. Tessa saw her younger sister, Brooke Mercer, on the couch, scrolling her phone. Brooke did not look shocked. She looked irritated, like this was an interruption. Diane crossed her arms and said they all talked, and they all agreed. Diane said Tessa and Sophie could not stay there anymore, and it would be better for everyone. Tessa asked what that meant, and Diane repeated it slowly, like it was final. Diane said the family decided, and the decision was done. Sophie stood behind Tessa trembling, and Tessa could hear her breathing speed up. Tessa did not scream, and she did not beg. She looked at her mother, then at her sister, and she nodded once. Tessa said she understood. Then she wrapped her coat around Sophie's shoulders. She walked Sophie back to the car, rain hammering the roof, and she drove away without another word. Tessa Warren drove with both hands tight on the wheel, and she kept her voice steady for Sophie Warren. Sophie sat curled in the seat, wet hair stuck to her cheeks, and her backpack hugged to her chest. Tessa asked if Sophie was hurt, and Sophie said she was cold, and embarrassed, and tired. Tessa pulled into a gas station, bought a towel, and a warm drink, then wrapped Sophie in the towel in the car. Tessa wanted to turn around and pound on the door again, but she did not. She knew Diane Mercer and Brooke Mercer would feed on any scene. Tessa chose distance instead, because distance was safer than rage. She called a nearby hotel, asked for the cheapest room, then drove there through sheets of rain. In the lobby, Sophie kept her eyes down, and Tessa kept her arm around her shoulders. They reached the room, and Tessa ran a hot shower, then sat on the bathroom floor, listening to the water, and listening to her own breathing. When Sophie came out in dry clothes, she looked smaller, like the day had stolen something. Tessa asked Sophie to tell her everything, from the moment the key failed. Sophie said the key turned, then stopped, and she knocked, and she could hear movement inside. Sophie said she waited under the small overhang, then the rain pushed in, and her shoes filled with water. Sophie said she called out for Grandma, and no one opened the door. Tessa felt her jaw lock, and she forced it to relax. She told Sophie that what happened was wrong, and it was not Sophie's fault. Sophie asked if they were homeless now, and Tessa swallowed hard, then answered clearly. Tessa said they were safe tonight, and they would be safe tomorrow, because Tessa would handle it. Sophie nodded, but her eyes stayed wide. Tessa ordered simple food, and they ate in silence. Then Tessa tucked Sophie into bed. When Sophie finally slept, Tessa sat by the window and watched the rain. and she wrote down every detail she could remember. Time, weather, and Diane's face behind that chain. She did not cry. She planned. The next morning, Tessa Warren called in late to work. Then she drove Sophie Warren to school, because she refused to let fear take over normal life. Sophie asked if Diane Mercer would come to the school, and Tessa said the school would only release Sophie to approved adults. Tessa updated the contact list before she left the office, and she asked the staff to call her for anything unusual. Then Tessa went straight to an attorney, Ethan Cross, recommended by a nurse she trusted. Ethan listened without interrupting, and he asked questions that sounded simple but mattered. He asked who owned the house, whose name was on the deed, and what happened after Mark Warren died. Tessa felt a sting at the name, because Mark had been gone less than a year. Tessa explained that she and Sophie moved in to care for Mark during his illness, and Diane insisted it would be easier for everyone. After Mark died, Diane acted like the house belonged to her, and Brooke acted like Tessa was a guest. Ethan asked if Mark left a living trust, and Tessa said she thought so, but Diane kept the paperwork. Ethan nodded like he expected that. He said many people hide documents when control is the goal. He asked Tessa if she had any old emails, any bank records, any messages about the trust. Tessa searched her phone in the office and found a thread from Mark, sent months before he died. Mark wrote that he put the home into a trust to protect Tessa and Sophie and to keep the house out of family drama. Tessa stared at the screen, and her throat tightened. Ethan asked her to forward the message. Then he said he would request official copies. He explained that if the trust named Tessa as trustee, or primary beneficiary, Diane could not legally lock her out. He also said changing locks to exclude an occupant, especially a child, could create serious legal trouble. Tessa listened, and she felt something return to her spine, a steady sense of direction. Ethan told her to document everything, and to avoid direct confrontation. He said the law works best when you stay clean. Tessa left the office with a checklist, and for the first time since the rain, she believed she could take her life back. That evening, Tessa Warren returned to the hotel room, and Sophie Warren looked up from her homework with tired eyes. Tessa sat beside her and explained the plan in clear, gentle words. Tessa said Mark Warren had protected them, and there was proof. Sophie asked if they could go home, and Tessa said yes, but they would do it the right way. Tessa told Sophie that adults sometimes use family as a weapon, but the law does not care about their stories. It cares about facts. Sophie nodded slowly, then asked why Grandma hated them. Tessa said Grandma did not hate them. Grandma wanted control, and control makes people cruel. The next day, Ethan Cross called with an update. He said he located the trust records, and the house was placed under a living trust tied to Mark estate plan. He said Tessa had legal standing, and Diane Mercer did not have the right to remove her. Ethan prepared formal notices, and he told Tessa not to warn Diane. He said surprise prevents damage and excuses. Tessa gathered what she could: her identification, Mark death certificate copy, school records for Sophie, and any mail showing their residency. She also printed the message Mark sent, and she saved screenshots in multiple places. When Diane texted that Tessa should stop causing trouble, Tessa did not reply. She forwarded the message to Ethan and added it to the file. On the third day, Ethan told Tessa they would schedule a return to the house with proper support. He explained that if Diane refused entry, law enforcement could assist with a civil standby to prevent escalation. Tessa picked Sophie up from school, and Sophie asked if they would have to see Grandma again. Tessa said only if necessary, and only with adults present. Sophie exhaled like she had been holding her breath all week. That night, Tessa lay awake, listening to Sophie sleep, and she kept seeing the chain on that door. She no longer felt helpless. She felt ready. On the morning Ethan Cross chose, Tessa Warren parked down the street and waited until he arrived. The sky was clear, but her stomach still felt like rain. Ethan stepped out with a folder in his hand, calm and focused, and a deputy met them at the curb for a civil standby. Tessa did not want police near her child, But she wanted Sophie Warren safe, and she wanted witnesses. Sophie waited in the car with a book, because Tessa refused to let her stand at that door again. Tessa and Ethan walked up the path, and Ethan knocked once, then twice, steady and professional. Diane Mercer opened the door with the chain on, the same small gap, the same dry face. She looked at the deputy, then at Ethan, then at Tessa, and her confidence flickered. Ethan introduced himself and said he represented Tessa, and he explained that Tessa had legal rights to enter and reside. Diane said Tessa was unstable, and Tessa was causing drama, and Sophie was better off elsewhere. Ethan did not argue. He handed Diane the documents through the gap, and he asked her to remove the chain. Diane tried to close the door, but the deputy spoke, calm and firm, and said Diane needed to comply, or the situation would escalate legally. Brooke Mercer appeared behind Diane, eyes wide, and she whispered something sharp. Diane finally removed the chain, and the door swung open. The hallway smelled familiar, coffee and air freshener, like they were pretending nothing happened. Tessa stepped inside, heart pounding, and she said nothing. She walked straight to the room she and Sophie used, and she saw their belongings moved into boxes, like someone already claimed the space. She took photos, because Ethan told her to document. Diane followed her, protesting loudly, saying Tessa was ungrateful, saying Mark Warren would be ashamed. Tessa kept her voice even, and said Mark planned for this, and that is why Ethan is here. Ethan asked Diane and Brooke to stay back, and the deputy held position in the hallway. Tessa collected Sophie's school items, medication, and important papers, and she did it without shaking. When she returned to the front door, she looked at Diane and said one sentence, slow and clear. Tessa said, "You do not lock a child out in the rain and expect forgiveness the next day." Then she walked back to the car and brought Sophie inside, with Ethan and the deputy present, so Sophie could step into the house without fear. Sophie glanced around, quiet, then took Tessa's hand, and they went to their room together. Later that afternoon, Ethan Cross sat with Tessa Warren at the kitchen table and explained the trust in plain language. He said, Mark Warren placed the home into a living trust to protect Tessa and Sophie Warren and to prevent Diane Mercer from controlling the property. He said the trust named Tessa as the person with authority to manage the house, and Sophie as a protected beneficiary. Diane tried to interrupt, saying she was family and she deserved a say. Ethan kept his tone polite and firm and said family does not override legal documents. Brooke Mercer scoffed and asked if they were seriously being thrown out. Ethan said nobody had to be thrown out, but they had no right to exclude Tessa. He said if Diane Brooke refused to leave, the next step would be court enforcement. Diane laughed, then cried, then laughed again, changing masks fast. She claimed Mark was confused when he signed, and Tessa manipulated him. Tessa felt her hands clench, then she opened them on purpose. She said Mark was clear, and Mark wanted safety for Sophie. Ethan asked Diane if she had the original documents, and Diane said she did not know where they were. Ethan said he already had certified copies, and he placed them on the table. Diane stared at the pages, and her face hardened. Brooke said Tessa should just move out and stop being selfish, because Diane needed the house. Tessa looked at her sister and said Sophie needed stability, and Sophie needed a home. Ethan explained the next timeline, notices, and deadlines, and he said Diane and Brooke must stop interfering with access immediately. He also told them that changing locks, denying entry, and leaving a child outside could expose them to additional consequences. Diane called it a misunderstanding, and Brooke called it an overreaction. Ethan said, the record shows otherwise, and he asked them to sign an acknowledgement. They refused. Ethan noted the refusal, packed his folder, and told Tessa he would proceed. After he left, Tessa walked through the house quietly, checking windows, checking doors, checking the rooms. She did not feel victorious. She felt responsible. That night, Sophie slept in her own bed again, and Tessa sat in a chair nearby, listening to her daughter breathe, promising herself this would never happen again. The next day, the calls began. Diane Mercer contacted relatives, telling them Tessa Warren was cruel and that Tessa was trying to steal a grieving mother's home. Brooke Mercer posted vague messages online about betrayal and ungrateful children. Tessa learned about it when a cousin texted, asking if Tessa had really called police on her own mother. Tessa answered once carefully. She said the locks were changed, her child was left outside for 5 hours, and legal support was required to re-enter safely. The cousin stopped replying. Another relative called and said Tessa should forgive because Diane was under stress. Tessa said, "Stress does not excuse harm, especially to a child." Then she ended the call. Ethan Cross advised Tessa to communicate only in writing and to keep everything. Diane sent long texts pretending to be reasonable, asking to talk, asking to hug Sophie, asking Tessa to stop embarrassing the family. Brooke sent shorter messages, sharper ones, blaming Sophie for being sensitive. Tessa saved them all. Sophie asked why people were angry at them, and Tessa said some people get angry when they lose control. Sophie said she felt like she did something wrong, and Tessa corrected her immediately. Tessa said you did nothing wrong, and you never deserve to be left outside. That weekend, Diane tried to enter Tessa's room while Tessa was at work, claiming she needed something. Sophie called Tessa shaking, and Tessa told her to lock the door and call a neighbor. Tessa came home fast, and she realized the danger was not physical force, it was constant pressure. Ethan filed a request for a protective order related to property access, and he moved the case forward. Tessa changed the locks back, this time with proper authority, and she installed a small camera at the front door. She did not do it for drama. She did it for proof. That night, Diane banged on the door and demanded to be let in, and Brooke shouted from the driveway. Sophie held Tessa's arm, trembling, and Tessa kept her voice low. She told Sophie to go to her room, and she told her daughter she was safe. Then Tessa called Ethan, and she kept recording, because the truth was now their shield. Ethan Cross moved fast, because delay only rewards people who push boundaries. He prepared filings, gathered screenshots, and attached the timeline. Tessa Warren wrote the night of the rain. He included photos of the changed lock and messages from Diane Mercer and Brooke Mercer that proved intent. Tessa stayed calm in every step, because calm kept the record clean. Sophie Warren went to school each day, but she watched every doorway like it might bite. Tessa met Ethan after work, and he explained the next hearing in simple terms. He said the court would focus on documents, residency, and the trust, not on family feelings. On the hearing day, Tessa sat straight, hands folded, while Diane performed grief and innocence. Diane claimed she was protecting the home, and she claimed Tessa was unstable. Brooke added that Sophie was dramatic, and that the rain story was exaggerated. Tessa did not interrupt. She let them talk, because lies grow louder when facts stay quiet. Ethan presented the living trust records, the certified copies, and the message from Mark Warren about protecting Tessa and Sophie. He also presented the school records and mail proof, showing Tessa and Sophie lived there. The judge asked direct questions, and Diane's answers kept changing. The judge then issued a clear order. Diane and Brooke had to stop interfering, and they had to move out by a specific deadline. Diane looked stunned, and Brooke looked furious, and Tessa felt her chest loosen. Outside, Diane hissed that Tessa would regret this, and Brooke called Tessa cruel. Tessa did not respond, because she was done feeding their story. That night, Sophie asked if they were safe now, and Tessa answered carefully. Tessa said they were safer, because paper can turn into protection. Tessa said the house belongs with the trust, and the trust belongs with truth. Sophie nodded, still tense, but her breathing slowed. Tessa tucked her in, then sat at the kitchen table, writing one more note for the file. She wrote that a boundary is not a fight, it is a line, and the line will hold. The deadline arrived, and Diane Mercer still acted like she could outweigh the law. Brooke Mercer packed slowly on purpose, slamming doors, dragging boxes, and muttering insults. Ethan Cross advised Tessa Warren to keep distance and let enforcement do its job. A deputy arrived with the court order, calm and firm, and asked Diane and Brooke to leave. Diane tried to argue, tried to cry, then tried to charm, switching masks in seconds. The deputy did not react. He repeated the order. Diane then asked for more time, and the deputy said they had 15 minutes for essential items. Tessa stood in the hallway with Sophie Warren behind her, holding her hand tight. Sophie stared at the scene like it did not feel real, like family could not look this sharp. Brooke snapped at Sophie to stop watching, and Tessa stepped between them. Tessa said Sophie will not be spoken to like that. Not again. Diane glared at Tessa and said Mark Warren would be ashamed, and Tessa felt the old pain rise. Then she remembered the message Mark sent and the trust he created. Tessa said Mark planned for this because Mark knew who Diane was. Diane went quiet for a moment, and that silence was louder than shouting. The 15 minutes passed, and Diane and Brooke carried bags to their car, still acting wrong. Diane turned at the driveway and demanded one last conversation. Tessa said no, because the conversation ended the night Sophie stood in the rain. The deputy watched until they drove away. Then he nodded to Tessa and left. The house became still, like it finally exhaled. Sophie started to cry. Not loudly, just exhausted tears. Tessa held her and said, "This is not your fault." And it never was. Sophie asked why Grandma did it, and Tessa answered with truth that a child could hold. Tessa said some adults choose control over love, and you do not owe them access. That night, Tessa and Sophie ate dinner at their own table, in quiet, and the quiet felt different. It did not feel empty. It felt safe. In the days after Diane Mercer and Brooke Mercer left, the messages turned into noise from a distance. Relatives called, asking for explanations, asking for peace, asking Tessa Warren to be the bigger person. Tessa replied once to each person, then stopped. She said the facts are simple. Sophie Warren was locked out, and the trust proved the home was not Diane property. She said, peace cannot be built on a child fear. Ethan Cross helped Tessa finalize practical steps, updating locks, confirming residency, and making sure all documents were stored safely. Tessa also met with Sophie's school counselor and ensured the staff knew who could pick Sophie up. Sophie began to relax in small ways, leaving her coat on a chair instead of keeping it close. She started sleeping through the night again, and she stopped jumping at every sound. One evening, Sophie asked if they would ever talk to Diane again. Tessa did not answer fast, because she wanted honesty, not comfort. Tessa said contact would only happen if there was real accountability over time, with clear rules, and with Sophie choices respected. Sophie nodded, like she liked having a say. Tessa then made a new tradition, small but powerful. She let Sophie choose the dinner, choose the music, and choose the movie, because choice is the opposite of control. Tessa also placed one framed photo of Mark Warren on the shelf, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Mark loved them, and Mark protected them, and his plan still held. That night, Tessa wrote one final line in her notebook, then closed it. She wrote that family is not the people who demand the most. Family is the people who keep you safe. Weeks passed, and the house began to feel like a home again, not a battlefield. Tessa Warren kept her routine steady: work, school drop-offs, dinner, and quiet evenings with Sophie Warren. Sophie started sleeping through the night, and she stopped checking the front door every time a car passed. Diane Mercer and Brooke Mercer did not disappear. They changed tactics. They told relatives that Tessa was cold, and that the court was unfair, and that Sophie was used as a weapon. They said the lock was a misunderstanding, and the rain story was exaggerated, and they only wanted peace. Tessa did not chase their version, because chasing lies gives them oxygen. When a cousin called asking why Tessa would do this to her own mother, Tessa answered calmly, and only once. Tessa said Sophie was left outside for 5 hours in the rain after the locks were changed, and that alone ended the conversation. Tessa said Mark Warren placed the home in a living trust to protect his wife and child, and the judge enforced what Mark already decided. The cousin went quiet, then said she did not know that, and the call ended. Ethan Cross advised Tessa to keep every message, even the ones that sounded sweet, because sweetness can hide pressure. Diane left voicemails with a soft voice, asking to see Sophie, asking to drop off gifts, asking for one small talk. Brooke sent sharper texts, blaming Tessa for financial trouble, and blaming Sophie for being sensitive. Tessa saved them all, and she did not respond. Sophie asked if Grandma would ever say sorry. Tessa told her that an apology is not just words. It is change, and change takes time. Tessa asked Sophie what she wanted, and Sophie said she wanted to feel safe, and she wanted adults to stop yelling. Tessa promised that yelling would not enter their home again. On a quiet Sunday, Tessa and Sophie cleaned the kitchen together, then baked cookies the way Mark used to like them. Sophie laughed when flour got everywhere, and the sound felt like light returning. That evening, Tessa sat on the couch and watched Sophie read, and she realized the ending was not about winning a case. It was about refusing to let a child learn that love means enduring harm. Diane and Brooke could keep telling their story forever. Tessa would keep the truth, and she would keep the door locked to anyone who tried to rewrite what they did.